Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
House After House by Lucinda J. We've had a history of living in houses with strange occurrences, so many that we used to think, was it us or was it the house? But it's been house after house of supernatural experiences. I've come to think for now it's the houses and not us that are haunted. And one reason I believe this is because in 2016, we were seeking help from a team of exorcists, priests, and lay people in that field, as we were having a lot of issues with one home. A woman with paranormal abilities we consulted, who referred to herself as a seer, told us that it was not us, but the houses. We'd been living in a very active house that to this day is very difficult for me to talk about, and changed me and my family forever. We did move, thankfully, to spiritually safer locations. The more recent houses we lived in did have suspicious activity, but I questioned things, and I try to be very skeptical. From 2017 to 2019, we lived in a house built in 1901. You just gotta wonder about all the history these turn-of-the-century beauties witnessed. Loved the house, but it needed work. A month after moving in, my son Tom, who was 13 at the time, had an experience that jarred him. He was in middle school, which had an early bus pickup time. The routine was, he'd get up just before 6 a.m., eat, dress, and get ready. Point being, he'd be fully awake. I'd help him gather his things, and I would go back to bed before I had to start getting his siblings up for grade school. As soon as I laid back down, my son came running up the stairs and jumped into bed with me in distress, screaming that there was a ghost downstairs. My big boy was white and shaking, clearly upset. Hysterical. At first I thought he was joking, but the more he went on, I realized he wasn't joking. He said he went to the living room and saw a shadow man close to 6 feet tall, all in black, standing in the middle of the room looking at our record player, which was one of those newer models that are designed to look old. They're brown and boxy with that fake antique look. The shadow man was looking at it and then eventually walked into the record player and absorbed himself into it and disappeared. It didn't bother or engage Tom, but still, from the trauma of our earlier house that things were very bad with, my son had a panic attack at the mere sight of another possible ghostly form. Logically, I thought, maybe it was a real man who broke in, and maybe he was hiding near the record player, just crouching down. I went downstairs, turned on all the lights, and did a search of the rooms. Nothing. Meanwhile, Tom was literally terrified. I kept saying, "Are you sure it just wasn't your brother?" "No, are you sure you didn't imagine it?" "No. Are you sure you didn't fall asleep and dream it?" "No." Tom never saw it again, but he still feels what he saw was real. No one else in the family ever saw anything else while we lived there, although my husband swore he heard voices and footsteps in the hallway on several occasions. I also think I heard footsteps coming up the stairs and down the hallway on several occasions, but I guess you could say I just didn't want to allow myself to entertain the reality of that. I suppose it's a possibility that Tom was having a flashback of sorts, or it's also a possibility that something followed us from the previous home, or even something that was attached to our then 1901 home. In 2019 to current times, we moved again to a rental house built in 1940. It's nice, but it has a lot of stairs. There are a series of cement steps and landings from the street to the house. I didn't want to move there because of the steps, and I joked saying there's so many steps it's enough to cause a heart attack. Our landlord half laughed, but said one of his workers or painters, when preparing it, was walking up and did have a heart attack and died inside the doorway at the foot of the staircase. Ugh, how terrible. Because of several obligations, one being my elderly relative that was in walking distance a few houses down, was in need of constant care, and we agreed to move in anyway. A few days after we moved in, junk mail addressed to the previous owners came. They had an unusual name, so I decided to Google them. An article popped up saying the man who lived there had died in the home. He was in his 30s, a father, and loved history reenactment with costumes. The pictures in the article showed him standing at the bottom of our staircase, and there were costumed hats hanging on the wall behind him in a decorative pattern. I looked at the wall, and there were holes there where the hats had been hanging in the picture. Kind of gave me the willies when I looked at the photos. Just something about it gave me a connection to the person, and I felt like I could sense him there. The next day, the kids were at school. I was home alone, and I saw a ball explosion of blindingly white light in the spot at the bottom of the steps. I just stared at it and thought, did I just see that? Oddly, it was right at the same spot that I saw the previous owner standing in the photographs, and I'd say it lasted a full 5 seconds. Over the next few days, early mornings, I'd see a smaller, quicker 2 to 3 second version of the same thing. A flash of white light in the same spot, but smaller and fainter. After our first month there, I didn't see it again, and I thought, there's got to be a plausible explanation. Could it be an electrical issue? But there weren't any outlets in that location, and I'm still looking for plausible other possibilities. If it was something, was it the man who had lived there? Or maybe even the worker who died in the doorway? One of my daughters, Sylvie, was very affected by spiritual activity in previous houses. In one home there was a thing in her closet, a shadow man. That experience had traumatized her to this day, so the topic is very sensitive to her. She came to me recently and said that she thinks the house has something in it, and I tried to reassure her with logical things that she's experiencing. I'm still unsure if she's imagining things, still traumatized by earlier experiences. We have talks often of how much the shadow man has affected her. For her, it's on a level of terror that we have seen therapists. So it's really hard for me to discern that if it could be happening again, or maybe is it just replaying in her mind of the prior past incidents. Mostly, she says with this house, this thing, it, is in the basement. Her chore, which she really truly loves, is laundry. She loves to wash and fold everyone's laundry and finds it relaxing with the clean, fresh lavender oil scents. So she would always go alone to the laundry room in the basement. But here, she says something touches her from behind every once in a while, touches her hair and even her shoulders. She doesn't like it or find it cool, and it bothers her, and she says doors open and close down there, and she often hears footsteps. I keep telling her to pay it no mind, but that's more out of reassurance. I'm not sure if any of this is real or not. Maybe I guess I just don't want to believe it. Could she also be reimagining it from prior trauma she experienced? We talk openly about it, and mostly I just want to think that no matter what, I'll protect her and my son, and we'll be okay.
Google Street View by Lord of the Highway. I had a weird thing happen to me a couple of years ago. My lifelong friend took his own life at the end of June 2018. No one saw it coming. From the outside, he had a great life. Good job, wonderful family, usually upbeat and positive, so it was a serious shock to all of us that were close to him, and it was heart-wrenching to learn he had been hiding his depression from all of us for so long. It hit me pretty hard. He was pretty close to just being a brother to me. A few months after he died, I was sitting at the bar of a local dive getting some lunch and chatting with the bartender, who I knew pretty well. She started telling me about how things had gotten weird with her roommate lately, and that the gal was wigging out about this new guy the bartender was dating, and making all kinds of weird threats about him infringing on their life, including a threat that she would take her own life if things didn't change. I told her that was all pretty fucked up, but didn't dismiss her threat of suicide. I opened up to her about my own friend and how difficult it was when he actually did the deed. It was the first time I had talked about it to anyone aside from my buddy's widow, his mom, and my own wife. I got a little emotional talking to the bartender about it. After lunch, I headed to the grocery store to stock up for the week. I was standing in line waiting to check out and pulled out my phone to see if another one of my friends had texted me since we were chatting about stuff earlier that day. There was nothing on the phone, so I turned it off and put it in the front pocket of my shorts, got through the line, and headed back home with the groceries. I decided to check my phone again before I unloaded the car,
and the screen was open to Google Street View, and it showed the picture of my deceased friend's house. I thought, okay, this is weird, and closed the app. Saw my contacts were open as well, with his contact info displayed. I had a bit of a what the fuck moment. When my phone is off, there's no way that could have happened without the screen being unlocked. And I'd never butt-dialed anyone before or since, and had my phone in the front pocket of my baggy cargo shorts. It was a little perplexing. That night I wrote his widow an email and told her what had happened, and she wrote back and said, I don't want to freak you out or anything, but go back to Street View and move the camera around the corner so you can see the back of the house. I did, and there he was, on the back deck. A blurry picture of my friend, staring at the Google truck. The whole thing was kind of creepy, but also a little comforting in a strange way, despite the fact that I don't really believe in an afterlife.
The Lonely One, submitted by Crystal Palace. When I was a kid, I grew up in a little town in Virginia near Reston. That was the biggest town nearby, but anyway, we had the usual haunted house rumors and the crazy guy who really was just a mentally challenged man. We all thought he was just crazy, but he ended up being related to a friend I met in middle school, but that's neither here nor there. That's how I found out that he wasn't crazy. There was one story, though, that I believe because it was true. Some people might not believe it, but those who have seen this man know it's not a bunch of phooey. While the area at that time was still mostly farmland, and Reston was only incorporated as a town in the late 60s, mind you, there was a guy who had a farm that he worked all by himself. He lived in a small house, alone, other than his 2 dogs. The story goes that he was very quiet and just went about his business, and that's it. He never made relationships with anyone, just sold his crops and bought his food and supplies. He was a solitary guy, and I guess there were stories about how he lost his family in a fire and kind of went into a shock and never came out of it. All he did was work on his farm and his house. He died when I was about 5, and from what people could gather, he was working on a light fixture in his house, and instead of using a ladder, he was standing on a chair. He slipped, broke his neck, and was gone. Someone making a delivery a few days later noticed something was wrong with his dogs, and then they found him dead inside his house. At the edge of his property, there was a large open space that us kids used to play baseball in. If we hit a fly out into his crops and he was out there, he would shag it and throw it back to us. Never smiling, never angry. It was just like another thing for him to do, just like working on his farm. So when he died, of course, some kids started a rumor that his house was haunted. It was actually bought by a young couple. And they said at night you could see him walking around his property. They called him the Lonely One, and the story was that he thought he was still alive and was still having to work on his farm. I was about 12 or so when one night me and some buddies were camping out and telling scary stories in my backyard. The Lonely One came up, and we all started daring one another to hike out to the property to see if we could see him. It wasn't a farm anymore, and today it's now a subdivision. But at that time, it was just a grassy plot of land. It was about a mile away or so 3 of us waited until my parents were asleep, and then we took off to just scare one another. When we got to the place, it was after midnight, but there was a full moon, so we could see almost everything in that silvery light the moon throws. We got to our ball field area and started daring each other to go into the land where the Lonely One's farm used to be. The other guys chickened out. Finally, I just said, okay, I'll go. So to prove how tough I was, I said I'd walk from one side of the land to the trees and then back, probably a good 200 or 300 yards over and then another 200 or 300 yards back. I remember being scared but not wanting to look like a yellow chicken, so I went on. When I got to the other side, I could sort of make out my friend's way in the distance. When I turned around, I saw a figure walking along the edge of the forest. Not wanting to get caught trespassing, I started walking quickly back. And then I turned around, and the person I thought I saw wasn't there anymore. So I just turned again and kept moving back towards my friends. A few seconds later, I heard them yelling at me to hurry,
and they weren't trying to keep quiet. One of them yelled out, "For Christ's sake, the lonely one is right behind you!" I knew they were trying to scare me, but curiosity got the best of me, and I turned around. Holy God, they weren't kidding. The person that had been walking along the woods was now walking at me really fast. I froze for a second, and then flight kicked in over fight, and I ran as fast as I could to my friends who were yelling their heads off. I got to the edge of the field, to the ball field, crashed into my buddies, and after a second, we all looked back, and about 10 yards away stood what I can only say was the lonely one. He wore old-time clothes and a straw hat, and he just stood there looking at us. We couldn't see his face, at least I couldn't. It was just a dark, black canvas. He stood there for a while before turning around and then fading away. We thought maybe it was the guy who now owned the land and the house, but we noticed the lights in the house coming on, obviously due to our yelling. We got up and ran all the way back to my yard, got in my tent, and then just laid there, catching our breath. After that, we heard lots of other people telling the same story about the lonely one and how they ran into him out there. I still have a friend who lives in that area, and he says even now that it's a subdivision, people claim that they see a strange man walking the streets that once was his farmland. Pretty creepy if you ask me. Camping Experience Gone Wrong by Anise John Min. When I was 11 years old, my school held a 2-day and 1-night camping experience in our school. It's a Chinese school in Masai, Johor, Malaysia. I'd rather not reveal the name of the school, but the camping experience was held only for the 11-year-old students, or as according to the Malaysian education system, standard 5 students. There were exactly 229 students in the 5th standard, boys and girls together. The afternoon went well as half the night, but at 10 p.m., we were having a barbecue session. I have a large group of friends consisting of 32 friends or so, boys and girls of different cultures and religions. My 6 best friends and I are usually the type of people to jump headfirst into any supernatural situation, but that night even we were shocked to the core. That night had been a Malam Jumat, which means Thursday night. It's usually believed by Malaysians that ghosts are extremely active and love to wander and disturb people most on Thursday nights, more than any other normal night. I remember making howling sounds just to remind my friends that it was a Thursday night. It was all fun and laughs, until Amara, one of my 6 best friends, screamed suddenly and said that there were red eyes looking at us through the front storeroom bell tower on top of the office building. Not only had she seen it, but also a few other Chinese students had spotted it as well, although when she screamed at us to look, there wasn't anything there. That was when the rest of us students felt a chill run down our spines. The teachers didn't notice our silent panicking at all, and all of us were silently panicking, having that gut feeling that something was wrong. Behind us was the block containing the standard 6 students' classrooms. It was the darkest building there at the moment. Some of us turned completely. Some stood up and walked closer to the building to get a closer look, and others were only sending glances, either wishing to catch a glimpse of something or nothing at all, but just doing it to appear brave. I was one of the ones to move closer to the building to get a closer look, but alas, I found nothing. Instead, when I looked at the block building which contained our classrooms and the 3rd standard students' classrooms, I looked into the 4th floor's 5th classroom at the end of the hallway on the left beside the girls' toilet. I saw a woman with messy, long black hair covering her face, wearing a long white dress which was blood-stained, and she was looking directly at all of us students. Think The Ring, but for real. The scariest part about it was that was my classroom. I just stood shocked at the sight, and other people ran away towards the tents in the arenas, and some people started screaming and crying. Some people ran to the toilet out of fright with their friends. My group and a few other friends were still there at the barbecue area. The teachers told us to just continue eating at the camping area, which was the big assembly hall for the girls, and the small assembly hall for the boys. That was a night I would never forget. We all saw that woman, It certainly scared all of us, but luckily it didn't disturb any of us at all, other than that scene at that time of the night. After that, there were rumors that started circling around the school, saying that the ground that the school had been built on was a graveyard. Then it became a mental hospital before becoming our school. I don't believe those rumors, seeing as the ones that spread them had no solid proof, but I know what I saw that night with my own eyes. There was a ghost woman standing in my classroom.
Bad Thing in My House, submitted by Never Forget. I'll keep the backstory short to get to the actual story. Thanks for reading this if you do. I'm 34 now, and this happened in the mid-90s. My family moved into a house after my dad got a big promotion. We'd been living in a 2-bedroom apartment, but I was 11, my sister was 15, we had 2 dogs, and we were literally on top of one another. My sister is named Danielle, but we called her Danny. Don't let that confuse you. She and I were about to have our own rooms, and we were really happy about that. And there was a big backyard for our black lab Smokey and our Jack Russell Terrier Jesse. Plus, Danny and I could play catch and pitch. We were and still are rabid softball players. None of that slow pitch bar league stuff. We're in fast pitch leagues, but we live in different states now. The house was built in the 50s, and it was a 3-story layout with all the bedrooms on the 2nd floor, a full-size attic, and a basement which my dad was going to refinish. And he did during all of this craziness. He's a salesman, and it often took him away from the family, but the guy busted his hump, and his hard work is what got us the house in the first place. Not to say my mom wasn't a great worker. I hope she doesn't hear this. Lol. Anyway, here's the story. We moved in March of that year, and my sister and I didn't get a chance to really explore the yard or anything until the snow melted. When it did, my mom made sure we did our chores out there, cutting the grass, weeding, helping her with the gardens, and so on. There was a detached garage, and the fenced-in yard again was perfect for the dogs. One Saturday morning, I want to say in late May, Danny and I were out there throwing the ball around, waiting for my mom to get back from the garden center. The dogs were going nuts because they wanted our softball, so we took turns whipping tennis balls around the yard for them to chase. Smokey loved to retrieve and kept bringing his ball back to me, but Jesse kind of disappeared after a bit. We found him digging up a piece of garden at the far end of the yard behind a huge bird bath the previous owners had left. Mom was actually buying some plants to put in that very area, and if you know anything about Jack Russells, it's that they love to dig. I mean, they really go at it when they feel in the mood to do it. When we got over to him, Smokey jumped in and they both began fighting over a felt cloth bag with a drawstring on it. Jessie would not let it go. Danny and I laughed before she finally grabbed it away from both of them. There was a pretty complex knot on the string, and despite trying to undo it, we couldn't. My mom pulled into the driveway, and we left the bag on the roof of her Jeep as we unloaded the plants and stuff. Honestly, we forgot about it, helping Mom with gardening, and then we had lunch. My friend Allison and her sister lived a street over, and there was a park just a block down the way, so we ended up getting a pickup game of ball going until it was supper time. Me and Danny got home and saw my mom with the cloth bag, and she was trying to undo the knot. She asked us where it had come from, and we told her that Jessie had dug it up in the back garden. She made supper while we sat at the kitchen table trying to undo the knot, and finally we got it loose despite the crusted dirt and mold all over it. Inside was a clamshell-shaped metal, for lack of a better term. It looked like a big locket you'd wear on a necklace, but we couldn't figure out how to spring the clasp. It wasn't pretty or anything. I mean, there were no marks on it, or whatever, just a dull, gray, metal-shaped thing. My mom tried to open it, but she couldn't figure it out either. The funny thing was, any time we touched it or messed with it, both of our dogs would get up from the floor and either bark or jab at it with their noses. We had supper and then watched a movie, Clueless, which is still one of my all-time favorites. Mom had gone to bed, and Danny and I fell asleep. I woke up and I heard a strange thumping coming from the kitchen. At first I thought it was Smokey or Jessie, but Jessie was upstairs in my sister's room where she always slept, and Smokey was right there at my feet. He always slept in my room, but never left me if I was downstairs. I went to get a drink of water and heard the thumping again. It was coming from our basement door that was in the kitchen. I don't know why I wasn't afraid or anything, but I went over to the door and opened it, and the thumping stopped, and I thought, well, maybe there's a squirrel or something in the wall. As I was shutting the door, I heard a different sound, kind of a gasp gurgling, and then it stopped. I shut the door and would soon find out that that sound would get louder and worse. The next day, my dad came home from Vegas and, of course, saw the medallion thing. We told him all about how we had found it, and after a half hour of messing with it, he finally got the clasp to spring open. We were watching him at the kitchen table when he opened it, and we saw there was a mixture of powder with some heavier grainy stuff in it. There was also a silver piece of metal that turned out to be a crucifix. It was really creepy, and the minute we saw that, there was a loud bang in the basement, and the door opened on its own. I know it sounds silly, but we all felt a breeze blow by us right out the basement door before it... I know it sounds silly, but we all felt a breeze blow by us before the basement door then slammed shut. This is when things got bad. We all kind of looked at each other, and when I said, "Dad, what was that?" he just closed the metal and got up and went out to the garage. He was out there for a while, and my mom told us to stay in the house. That night, we were all woken up by a pounding in the basement. Jesse and Smokey started barking, and Smokey wouldn't let me go out of the door of my room. He just stood there between me and the door. I heard my dad come out of his room and run downstairs as the pounding kept up. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, but both me and my sister's bedroom windows flew up on their own. As I said, it was in May, so it wasn't quite summer yet, and both windows had been locked. They were newer replacement windows upstairs in the back of our house. The rest were those older rope pulley windows with weights, if you know what I mean. Danny screamed when it happened, and the dogs went nuts again. My mom rushed into her room and then yelled out and asked if I was okay. By that time, my dad had made it back upstairs and burst into my room. Between me and Danny, we told them what had happened. Dad calmed us down, and we ended up grabbing our pillows and blankets and sleeping on the floor in my parents' room that night. We all woke up really tired and had to go to school. I told Allison what had happened, and she just laughed and made jokes about ghosts, but I told her no, it really happened. She teased me for a while, but later when I told her the other things that were going on, she changed her tune. That night after supper, Danny and I were in the backyard poking around where Jesse had dug up the metal, which, by the way, we didn't even know where it was as my dad had hid it somewhere in the garage. I turned to look at our house and saw the basement lights turning on and off through the windows. Just then my parents came around the side of the garage, so we knew it wasn't them. My dad noticed it and ran into the house, and then it stopped. As I said, things got worse. Almost every night there would be moments of absolute silence, followed by pounding, and then that strange gasp gurgling sound. I mean, it was now so loud it felt like it was in every room. Things started moving on their own. Everyone in the family either saw stuff move or found things in different areas than where they should have been. One evening during a lull in the noises, I watched our TV remote lift up from the coffee table and glide across the room by some unseen hand. But even things like this stopped having a sense of wonderment when objects started hurting us. Danny was hurt on 2 occasions by picture frames that had been tossed at her, while the rest of us stood watching as they flew through the air at her. My mom said we needed to have someone from church over to help us with whatever was going on, but my dad wanted to keep things in the house and kept saying that they would stop on their own. Another month went by, and we were now in the middle of summer. It sounds silly, but we had gotten so used to everything, but that gasping, gurgling thing never stopped bothering me. I would hear it at night all the time, and even when no one else did. None of us knew it at the time, but my dad had been looking into things about the house from day one when all this strange stuff had started. He didn't even tell my mom, but he'd spoken to people in the town hall, his realtor and the realtor who sold the place, and all that kind of stuff. One day I went down to the basement, something I hated after hearing those noises. I just had to get some laundry done. It was in the middle of the morning and sunlight was streaming in through the windows, when suddenly everything got really dark, like the windows were being covered up. That's when I heard the gasping, gurgling sound louder than ever. I ran back upstairs screaming, and Danny came running into the kitchen. I told her what had happened, and we just got the dogs and went to the park. My dad came home from another business trip, and just like that, everything stopped. No more noises, nothing floating around on its own, nothing. We all stopped talking about it, and it seems like things were just lighter in the house, just like when we'd moved in. It wasn't for another 10 years or so that my dad finally told us what had happened. I was in college, Danny was married and living in Indianapolis, and my parents had sold the house and moved to another part of town. My dad had told my mom what he was up to in his research, but they both decided to not tell Danny and me about what he'd found out. Dad learned that the owners of the house before the people my parents bought it from had been a pretty miserable couple, always fighting and hitting each other, just nasty people. One day, the wife snapped and strangled the husband while he slept. At the time, she staged a scene so it looked like he hung himself from a rafter in the basement, and the police never questioned it. I guess she made it look good enough to fool them. But even though she was only in her 50s, she died from cancer. On her deathbed, she admitted to killing her husband, but the house seemed to be plagued with paranormal activity and all the same things that we experienced. She had the ashes of her husband in an urn in the house, but someone, the realtor my dad talked to didn't know who, told her to bury some of the ashes with a crucifix and the medallion we had found, as far away from the house as possible, but still on the immediate premises. This was supposed to keep his spirit or ghost or whatever from coming back in the house. So, when Jesse dug it up and we brought it into the house, we somehow invited him back in or something like that. I don't know how much I believe in all that, but all I know is that stuff happened to us, and it stopped the minute my dad put that medallion back in the ground. The Thing in the Closet by M. Dillon 12. When I was a little kid, I was sort of afraid of the dark. I just couldn't get used to it, even with a nightlight and stuff. It used to drive my parents crazy, and I would show up in their bedroom trying to crawl in their bed. I'm a guy, by the way, and I did get over it. But when I moved out on my own when I was 18, something weird happened that I will never forget. I was a super independent kid growing up as a latchkey kid. I learned how to cook early on as my parents were working overtime and in my mom's case 2 jobs. I took after them. I started a paper route at 10, saved all my money and started working another job when I turned 15 after school. By the time I was 18, I had bought my own car and with some creative paperwork, bought my first condo and moved out. Everything was kicking ass. Hot girlfriend, good job, and going to school at night. But something was wrong at the place I bought. Everything was great about it except for the early morning hours, usually between 4 and 5. For whatever reason, I would wake up every morning, and as soon as I did, my closet door would open, stay open for a minute or so, and then close on its own. You bet I was freaked out, remembering how I was afraid of the dark as a kid, and then seeing that happen. But each time I looked into the closet, I could see a darker shape standing in there in front of my clothes. It was somehow darker than everything else. Again, I was freaked out for sure, but there was nothing I could do about getting out of there. This wasn't a lease. I bought the place. I told my best friend Tom about it, and at first he laughed. But one night, we were on my balcony having some beers, and he said he was going to crash there that night. I told him we should wake up early, and he could see what was happening for himself, if it was going to happen again at all. So, I set my alarm for 3:30, hit the sack, and a little after it went off, Tom walked into my room and sat down on my desk chair. We didn't say a word and just waited. Without fail, at 4:15 a.m., my closet door opened, stood open for a minute, and then closed on its own. I looked at Tom with a, "Well, what do you think?" face, and he jumped up and tore open my closet door. He pulled all of my shirts and stuff to one side and just kept saying, "What the hell, man? What the hell?" We kept talking about it and then went out for breakfast, and he said he wanted to do some tests on the door to see if there was something like a draft or whatever that was causing the door to open. I said why not, and that began his week of crashing at my house after work. Every morning, the door would open and close, and he was brave enough to stand in the doorway with a candle to check for a breeze. And there wasn't any. One night he propped a chair up against the door, but it's still open, pushing the chair with it. He borrowed his dad's big old VHS camcorder and recorded the door doing its thing. On a side note, we sent that video into Unsolved Mysteries, that show that was on in the 80s, and we never heard back from them. Funny how that's back on now, and how cool it would have been to share that with you, Uncle Jay. But the door kept doing its thing every morning, and we had no explanation. My girlfriend hated it, and I ended up outfitting my spare bedroom as another place for us to be together. The closet in there never opened on its own, but we could hear the other one doing its thing every morning. Finally, I went out and got a latch system to attach to the door frame. It had one of those little bars that slid back and forth and fastened in place.
The next morning, the door started shaking violently, and I couldn't believe when I saw the bolt being drawn back on its own and the door swing open. This time, after it stood open for a minute, it slammed shut, and I learned that was probably a bad idea for me to do what I had done. I started using that room as an office workout space with my weight bench and stopped paying attention to the door and whatever was in there. I never did anything bad. While I was freaked out by it, I wasn't really afraid. Nothing really happened other than the door opening and closing on its own. But the shape that was so dark in there, again, reminded me of being a scared kid. About 5 years later, I sold that place, bought my first house, married a different woman, and started my own family. No closet doors opened on their own in that house, or the one I bought after that and live in now. I often wonder what the couple who bought the place from me thought about that closet, if whatever was in there kept doing its thing. Dark Entity, submitted by AutoCAD Dad 394. After an extremely long year of work, I decided to take a week of vacation with my family. Well, my two sons, Dylan and Jackson. We'd done the Disney thing, and my boys were now older and ready to check out other things out there. And I kind of pride myself on being the best rounded dad I can be by mixing up camping and amusement parks and that sort of thing. This trip, I thought it would be a good time to have a little time in the rig. I had just bought a Land Rover D110. I thought we could visit my brother in Bisbee, Arizona, and then camp out in various places in Arizona and New Mexico. My wife, God bless her, decided to visit her sister at that time and let us have what she called a He-Man week. I agreed, knowing that I'd already planned a surprise trip for just the two of us to Catalina a few months later. Take note, young bucks, don't forget your girlfriend or wife when you have kids. We lived outside of San Diego, and the three of us were looking forward to some road time and having a few laughs. My boys were 18 and 20 at the time, one getting ready for college and one getting ready to finish up. So, on a Saturday morning, we loaded up the roof rack, pulled the drop-downs in the back of the LR, got a comfy dog bed for Blitz, our German Shepherd, and away we went to Bisbee. My brother is a single guy through and through. Lots of girlfriends, but he never settled down. I got the brains in the family, he got the looks. It makes me laugh, but I think every 5 years he had a new woman on his hip, as my wife would say, and each was more gorgeous than the last. It was no surprise when we got there after the 9-hour drive that baby brother Chris was sitting there in the late-day sun at his pool with his latest supermodel. I'm not using anybody's real names, but I'll call him Chris, and I'll call her Heidi. I overheard my guys immediately talking about her, and I told them to cool it, even though I wasn't blind to her wearing next to nothing and stretched out in the sun. Chris jumped up and got a round of beers. Yes, I've let my boys drink since they were 16, and today, 12 years later, they still have a healthy respect for it and never got into trouble with it. My parents were off-the-boat Germans, and that's how I was raised, too. All right, enough of the backstory. We found out over burgers and hot dogs that Heidi considered herself a psychic medium. Not the crazy people you see on TV. She was actually really nice, and the woman my crazy brother eventually married. But we were all fascinated with her stories she told us as night fell, and we were sipping what was the best Barrio Brewing had to offer sitting around a chimenea. At one point, Heidi looked at my youngest boy, Dylan, and said there was something about him that attracted presences. He laughed, but she was serious, and she said there were 2 distinct presences standing behind him even as we were hanging out. The more she talked, the more I started to believe what she was saying. I normally don't go in for this sort of thing, not because I don't believe in ghosts and spirits, I just don't care. But I was interested in what Heidi was saying. Finally, we called it a night and went inside. My sons were planning on crashing on my brother's living room floor, and I was going to take the guest bedroom. After everything got quiet around 1 a.m., I heard my sons up talking about what Heidi had said. Then I heard Jackson yell out, "Dude, there's something behind you!" At first I thought they were fooling around, but when I went out to tell them to keep it down, I saw they were not playing. Dylan was up getting a couple more beers when Jack said he saw a dark shape materialize right behind him. He said it was so dark it blotted out the light from over the sink, the only light on in the kitchen and the living room. I stood there with the, all right, let's not get carried away with this shit look on my face. But before I could say anything, Jack looked at me and said, Dad, I'm not kidding around. Something is in here. His face was as white as snow. I told everyone to calm down, that Heidi was nice and all, but she probably got some things in her head and it was late. We'd driven a long way and we were tired. I mean, every excuse I could use until I saw a dark shape appear in the kitchen and then move toward a part of the wall that split the two rooms. And this was the messed up part. When it hit the wall, a calendar hanging there in the kitchen fluttered its pages, and then on the other side in the living room, a framed collage of pictures popped off the wall and dropped to the ground. We all kind of yelped at that, and that brought Chris and Heidi out. While we were shaken by what we had just seen, we also had a little comedy relief, as my brother and his lady must have been fooling around. His boxers were on backwards, he was holding her panties, and she was wearing next to nothing. But despite being freaked out, I let out a laugh. It didn't last long. There was an audible whooshing sound or something like the wind coming through the living room, and some magazines on a coffee table blew over and fell onto the floor. Out loud I said, "What the hell is this?" And Heidi said, "This is not the same people I saw outside." We all stopped and looked at her, and it suddenly got very cold. I mean very cold. Not like someone jacked up the AC, but it was freezing. With the light coming in from the kitchen, we all saw a shadow thing appear in a far corner, behind a chair. My brother pointed at it, and we all watched as the chair started to rock back and forth, and this shadow thing just standing there. Chris said, "Everyone out onto the porch," and even Heidi, wearing nothing but a silk teddy, went through the kitchen, and we all stood on the deck. Dylan was the last one out, and right before he ran out, he screamed that his shoulder was on fire. It wasn't heat when I touched him, but his upper arm was so cold that it felt like it was burning, kind of like if you've ever had liquid nitrogen on you for a wart removal. I pulled him outside into the warmer air, and all of us turned to look at this dark shape now standing in the doorway, like it was looking at us. Jackson and Dylan were obviously beyond cool and didn't know what to say. This dark shape just kept going away from the door and then coming back to it, but never once did it come out onto the deck. Dylan was still holding his beer, and I grabbed it and downed it before asking Heidi just what the hell was going on. She said she didn't know, but this was not something that she had ever seen before. It wasn't good. Chris was firing all kinds of questions at her and was pretty upset, but finally the shadow thing faded away. We all stood out there for another 5 minutes before we went back inside. My boys were talking about sleeping in the truck with Blitz, who had been sleeping peacefully on the deck throughout this entire thing, until we came out and woke him up. They finally decided to stay in the living room again, and Chris told them to bring Blitz inside. Things were quiet until about 4 a.m. Heidi, Chris, and I had stayed up and were talking quietly in the guest room about what was going on. And Chris said that nothing like this had ever happened in the 12 years he owned the house, and that there was nothing in its history or around that area for that matter that was scary or crazy like this. Heidi was pretty straightforward and said she had never felt anything like it, and I asked her if she could talk to it or whatever the heck it is people like her do. She said if it came back, she'd try. We didn't have to wait long. I heard Blitz start to bark, and then Dylan yell out, and then there was a loud thud coming from the living room. The three of us jumped up and ran down the hallway to see what was going on, and Jackson was literally riding piggyback on Dylan as something unseen was pulling both of them across the floor. I dove at them and lay on top of them both, and whatever it was dragging them stopped. Heidi, who had since put more clothes on, started talking in this strange voice. Even in the faint light coming from over the sink in the kitchen, I could see her face was pale and her eyes looked really dark. The four of us stared at her, and Blitz was barking at the corner where the chair was. We all kind of sat there, three of us on the floor, Chris standing up looking from the corner to Heidi and back. She kept saying these gibberish words, and then there was this bright flash of light like lightning had hit the house. Blitz stopped barking, Heidi stopped talking, and everything was dead silent. For the first time that night, I felt a calmness wash over me, and things felt, well, just normal again. Everybody had calmed down at that point, and I asked Heidi what had happened, but she looked at all of us and she said, "I don't know." We asked her what she'd been saying, and she didn't remember any of it. "That's the first time I've ever had that happen," she said. "I've never had anything like that go down. Normally I can speak with spirit, but honestly, I just remember coming in the room, and then that flash of light." We eventually fell asleep from exhaustion more than anything else. I slept out in the living room with my boys and Blitz. We stayed there another day before moving on with our trip, but nothing like that happened again, and nothing like that has happened at my brother's house since. He still lives out there with Heidi, but he always says that it was the only time something strange happened. Heidi is convinced that someone who had passed was attracted to my brother for whatever reason, and didn't know how to get to the other side. She thinks the flash we saw was the spirit of a lost soul who finally moved on to a different plane. I don't know, but I do know there was some weird stuff going on that night, but spirits in the afterlife? I just don't know. Ghost in the Garage, submitted by Annie Oakley 7. I'm not sure I'm good at this, and I don't know if this is scary or sweet, but it was scary for me at the time. I want to share my story and have for a long time. Only my immediate family knows about this, and I no longer live where I saw and heard all of this, so what's the harm, right? I'm changing the names and everything. My late husband was a soft-spoken and kind-hearted man. He entered our town's police force right out of high school and served for 30 years before retiring at 48. Our town was a typical suburb, and he was well-liked by everyone, was in the DARE program, volunteered at our church, and was planning on running for town council when the accident happened. I don't want to get into details, but he was killed while training for a marathon by a hit-and-run driver. No one saw the accident, but a person who lived nearby happened to be driving home and found my Jim on the side of the road and called for help. He died on the way to the hospital, and the driver was never found. And this was 15 years ago this August. Of course, my family was devastated. My son, Jim Jr., was 22 at the time, was just entering grad school, and had moved home to save money while he studied. My daughter was 25 and lived in a different state, but this really hurt our family, as you can imagine. Now to the crux of my story. My Jim had converted our two-car garage into a woodworking shop, his biggest hobby. I don't know all the tools and equipment he had or what they are called, but he had a lot of machines and hand tools. He made wonderful pieces of furniture and special items and either sold them or donated them to charity auctions and things like that. 3 weeks after his passing, my son and me were sitting in our family room going through some papers when we heard the sound of one of the machines in the garage turn on. We looked at each other, and Jim ran to the inside garage door and threw it open. The sound stopped as soon as he did this. There was no one in the garage, and the lights were off. I caught up to him and turned on the lights. The place was empty other than the usual shop stuff. I need to say that my Jim was meticulous with everything. Nothing was ever out of place, and everything was in its place, if you know what I mean. He was bald, and my wisecracker son used to call him Mr. Clean because he was such a stickler for neatness out there. We both kind of shrugged, and I said maybe it was just Dad saying hello and trying to laugh, but then I do remember crying and my son taking me back inside the house. Later that night, I woke up and went downstairs for some warm milk and went out to the garage. There was a very special piece of pink ivory wood that I had bought for my Jim's for Christmas. It was sitting on one of his machines. My son said it was a joiner. It wasn't there earlier, and as I mentioned, my Jim always kept everything in order out there, dusted and swept after every time out there, and all of his wood was stacked or sorted in a specific order. I just stood looking at it for a while and started crying again and closed the door. The next morning, it was still there, but I didn't mention it to my son. About a week later, during dinner, when my sister and sister-in-law came over, we heard noise from the garage again, but again, there was no one there. However, that piece of wood was now at a different saw. It hadn't been cut or anything. It was the same piece of wood. It was just in a different spot. I called to my son to ask if he had moved it, and he said he had no idea what I was talking about. But this sort of thing went on for another 2 weeks, with hearing noises out in the garage, until last night. I was just about to fall asleep after reading in my bed when I heard the garage door open. Our master suite was on the first floor. I sat there with the light on, thinking maybe it was Jim Jr., but then I heard him upstairs in his room. After waiting for a few minutes, I just turned out the light and fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, next to me on Jim's pillow, where he had slept with me for so many years, was the piece of pink ivory wood. After a few minutes of being baffled, I picked it up, got out of bed, and put it on my dresser next to our picture. Nothing ever happened again, and I'd like to think maybe it was his way of saying goodbye.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a story that you would like to hear narrated on my channel, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you'd like to follow me on social media, links to that are in the description below, and if you would like to support this channel, find me on Patreon. A link is down there as well. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and I will get back to any comments you post as fast as I can. Also, thanks for putting up with my advertising. I know some people hate that in the middle of a story, but I try to space them out as best I can, and hey, gotta pay the bills. Everyone, be excellent to each other. Social distance, wear a mask, wash your hands. We're gonna get through this. Until next time, remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door. If you're a serious comic book collector, just starting out your collection, or maybe you're just a casual reader, then you have to check out 3D Comics in Lancaster, New York. From graded comics, custom art lithographs, limited edition prints and statues, 3D Comics is a must-see for the serious enthusiast, but the laid-back atmosphere is perfect for anyone with a love for comic books and more. They also specialize in custom art Funko Pops, taking regular Funko Pops and having a team of artists do original art on the boxes. Each comes with a certificate of authenticity. Located at 32 Central Ave in the heart of the village of historic Lancaster, New York, 3D Comics is open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 6, with special appointments available on Sundays. Find them online at 3dcomicsandmore.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. And if you prefer to shop online, owner Joel Sharmani has tons of items available on eBay. Find a quick link to that on the shop's homepage. They also feature in-store appearances from today's hottest artists, special offers, and every Wednesday is New Comic Book Day. Give them a call at 716-860-7837, visit them online right now at 3dcomicsandmore.com, or better yet, just stop on in. But no matter where you are around the round world, 3D Comics is your destination for the best in comic books, custom art, and beyond. 3D Comics and More. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. Tell them Uncle Josh sent you.